On December 2nd, 1892, Wall Street threw a party. The stock market soared, investors celebrated. The entire nation breathed a sigh of relief, all because one man was dead. The newspapers called him a monster. Bombs were sent to his office. He himself once said, "I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half." He seized control of the telegraph, manipulating the flow of information the way social media algorithms do today, crushing his enemies with the single click of a telegraph key. And here is what you need to understand. This man, whose greatest talent was destruction, left behind not ruins, but one of the most beautiful buildings in America. In the next few minutes, I will show you how the most hated man in the country built his personal paradise on a foundation of other people's tears. We are used to thinking that castles are built for beauty or for protection from enemy armies. But his castle wasn't a home, it was a weapon. And to understand how it worked, you need to see the blood that paid for its stones. Above the Hudson River, its towers, like sentinels from another century, gaze into the flowing water. Every year, tens of thousands of people walk these paths. The clicks of camera shutters merge with the whispers of tour guides. For some, it's a Gothic fairy tale come to life. For others, it's the perfect set, familiar from the dark scenes of the movie Dark Shadows, or the lavish shots of the series The Gilded Age. Today, Lyndhurst is an icon, a model of taste, a symbol of a bygone era, a national treasure. But this idyllic scene is just a thin layer of varnish on very dark wood. It's a lie. We look at these elegant arches, at the delicate stone carvings, and we think this is a house built for parties and balls. We are wrong. This is not a house. It is a fortress. It is the architectural equivalent of a castle wall, built not against armies with trebuchets, but against newspaper cartoonists, ruined investors, and process servers. Every crenellation on this tower is a snarl. Every narrow, slit-like window is a suspicious glare. This castle is a monument not to creation, but to destruction. It was built not by an architect, but by fear. To understand Lyndhurst, you must understand its most famous owner. A man who didn't seek admiration, he demanded surrender. He was so despised that on the day he died, the stock market soared. Wall Street didn't just breathe a sigh of relief, it applauded. And in that lies the central paradox. How could a man whose greatest talent was destruction leave behind something so whole and beautiful? He broke companies, devastated markets, and crushed his competitors to dust. His legacy should have been ruins, financial ash. But instead, we have this castle, timeless, unshakable, saved from demolition and oblivion. Is this a mockery of history, or proof that even the most ruthless ambitions can, against their own nature, give birth to beauty? To find the answer, we must go back to the very beginning, to the source of the money that bought this castle, to the price that all of America paid. Before a single stone was laid in Lyndhurst's foundation, its price had already been paid not in checks and banknotes, but in bankruptcies, betrayals, and the tears of thousands. To understand this castle, you must first see the money it's made of. This capital wasn't earned, it was extracted. The story begins not with blueprints, but with a scam. Early in his career, Gould enters a partnership in a tannery. But while his partners work, Gould secretly funnels the company's money to Wall Street, playing the stock market. He drives the firm to the brink of collapse and then buys it out for a pittance, leaving his former partners with nothing. This was not a youthful mistake. This was the birth of his signature style, betrayal as a business model. But the real war, the one that turned him from a petty crook into a titan, was fought on the steel rails. It was the battle for the Erie Railroad. His opponent was Cornelius Vanderbilt himself, the richest man in America, accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. But Gould didn't play by the rules. When Vanderbilt began buying up stock to seize control, Gould responded with a move that sent Wall Street into shock. He simply turned on the printing press. In the basement of his office, day and night, his men printed tens of thousands of new, worthless shares. 100,000 illegal pieces of paper flooded the market, devaluing Vanderbilt's stake with every sheet sold. It was financial guerrilla warfare. When the court issued a warrant for his arrest, Gould didn't wait for the police. Under the cover of night, he fled across the Hudson, taking with him chests stuffed with $6 million in cash. From his refuge in New Jersey, he orchestrated his final act. He spent over $1 million to bribe the lawmakers of New York State. He didn't just avoid prison. He forced the government to legalize his fraud. He simply bought himself a new law. The pinnacle of his destructive genius was the scam known as Black Friday. Along with his partner Jim Fisk, Gould decided to corner the entire gold market of the United States. He used his connections to convince President Grant not to sell the government's gold reserves, while he secretly bought up gold, driving the price to the heavens. When the deception was revealed and the government dumped $4 million of gold onto the market, the pyramid collapsed. Thousands of families were ruined. The nation's financial system teetered, and Jay Gould, tipped off in advance, walked away with a clean profit of $11 million. This wasn't money. These were scars left on the body of the nation. And now, possessing a fortune forged from the losses of others, the most despised man in America had to decide what to do with it. He wasn't going to build a palace for parties. He was going to build a bunker. Money could buy anything. Railroads, telegraph lines, even politicians. But it couldn't buy one thing: an invitation. Jay Gould, a short, frail man with a quiet voice and the eyes of a predator, was the absolute master of Wall Street. But in the salons of Fifth Avenue, where old money whispered behind fans and champagne glasses, his name was spoken like a curse. He was an upstart, a destroyer, an outcast. It was this contempt that became the chief architect of Lyndhurst. Gould didn't need another mansion in a city where every door could be slammed in his face. He didn't need a house for balls to which he would never be invited. He needed a fortress. And in 1880, he found one. He didn't build from scratch. Why bother when you can conquer? On the banks of the Hudson, a ready-made castle already stood, a masterpiece by the architect Alexander Jackson Davis. Dark, asymmetrical, crowned with towers and battlements. It wasn't just a Gothic-style house. It was a declaration. In 19th century America, a country with no kings or aristocracy, Gothic was the fastest way to buy a pedigree. These arches and spires screamed of ancient lineage, of nobility, of power rooted in the centuries. Everything Jay Gould did not have. He bought it and turned it into his reflection. For him, these walls of gray, almost hostile stone were not a romantic fantasy. They were a statement carved in marble and addressed to all of New York society. You won't accept me? I will build my own world, and it will be stronger than yours. You want to destroy me? Try storming my walls. Lyndhurst became his stone skin. Its tower was his spine. Its narrow, suspicious windows were his eyes. The building doesn't invite. It watches. It doesn't charm. It warns. Every battlement on this roof was paid for by a market crash. Every arch was bought with someone else's bankruptcy. This is not the architecture of celebration. This is the architecture of war. He dreamed of founding a dynasty that would rule America forever. And this castle, this American version of Windsor, was destined to be their eternal home, their ancestral seat. He had bought himself a castle and a pedigree, but he wasn't going to live in someone else's house. He was going to conquer its soul. Jay Gould never built anything from scratch. His genius was not in creation, but in conquest. He took other people's companies, other people's ideas, other people's fortunes, and he did the same with his new home. This was not a purchase. It was a hostile takeover. His first victim was the legacy of its creator. The architect, Alexander Jackson Davis, was a titan of his time, but Gould didn't trust him. He trusted no one. His first directive was to hire his own firm to conduct a complete audit of Davis's work. Every beam, every stone, every blueprint was interrogated. This was not an act of respect for a genius, but an act of total control, a demonstration that there was now only one master here, and even the architect's ghost must obey his will. The castle groaned under this pressure, its original design tested for strength like a company before a takeover. Then, the physical invasion began. On the estate grounds stood an elegant conservatory, a harmonious part of the original design. Gould ordered it demolished without hesitation, and in its place, he erected a monster, a gigantic glass palace of steel and glass, 400 feet long. This was not a greenhouse. It was an industrial facility, a cathedral of metal built on the same principles as his railroad bridges. This glass leviathan was paid for by the monopoly on information he was establishing by taking over Western Union. It screamed of wealth and power, brutally violating the romantic tranquility of the park. The invasion continued inside. The dark Gothic halls, conceived as spaces for contemplation, were assaulted by wealth. Gould didn't change the structure. He occupied it. He poured money into the old walls like molten gold down a captive's throat. The rooms filled with the most expensive furniture from the era's best makers, Herder Brothers and associated artists, where Louis Comfort Tiffany himself worked. Each piece was not just furniture, but a share of stock, a financial instrument demonstrating the value of his empire. The dark wood of the walls began to drown in the sheen of silk, velvet, and gilt. This was not construction. This was an occupation. He took someone else's masterpiece, someone else's dream, and ruthlessly rewrote it in his own image, turning it into a monument to his paranoia and his limitless power. He was fortifying the castle from within, but he did so because he knew all too well the hatred that was building on the outside. Why would a man who owned railroads and the telegraph so desperately need stone walls? Because the world he was plundering wanted to destroy him. Lyndhurst was not a whim. It was a necessity. It was the physical manifestation of a fear born from the hatred of an entire country. This hatred was not abstract. It had a face, a voice, and a weight. The newspapers of the era are a chronicle of this hatred. Day after day, cartoonists depicted him not as a man, but as a monster. Here he is, a giant spider, his web entangling all of America, sucking the life out of farmers and workers. Here he is, the Mephistopheles of Wall Street, buying souls for devalued stock. These images were not just satire, they were a call to action, and people responded. The hatred began to knock on his door. In 1889, a package arrived at his New York office. Inside was not paperwork, but dynamite, a bomb capable of blowing him and his entire empire to smithereens. Only a fluke saved him from death. But the threat did not disappear. It breathed down his neck. It waited for him on the stairs. One day, a ruined investor named James R. McLean, who had lost everything due to Gould's manipulations, broke into his office. He lunged at the financier right on the steps. He was thrown back by guards, but the image remained. The enemy could appear from anywhere, at any moment. It was this fear that turned Lyndhurst into a besieged fortress. The high fence surrounding the estate was not just a property line. It was the first line of defense. The round-the-clock security patrolling the grounds was not staff. It was a garrison. Even the location of the castle, far from the city on the secluded bank of the Hudson, was chosen not for its beautiful scenery, but for its strategic isolation. Every evening, when the gates were closed, Lyndhurst became his personal bunker. Here, behind thick walls, he could finally breathe. Here, he hid. He hid from the ghosts of those he had ruined. He hid from the bombs in his mailbox. He hid from the consequences of his own actions. He had built an impregnable fortress to protect himself from the world. But he did not yet know that his bloodiest wars were yet to be fought, without ever leaving its grounds. While Jay Gould enjoyed the quiet of his Gothic castle, his empire was on fire. The battle he was waging had moved from the stock exchange floor to the steel rails of his own railroads. And this time, the stakes were not numbers on a page, but human lives. In 1886, the Great Southwest Railroad strike erupted. Thousands of workers on his railroad, driven to desperation by poverty wages and inhuman conditions, stopped working. The trains stood still. The economies of entire states were paralyzed. They were not asking for mercy. They were demanding justice. From the idyllic tranquility of Lyndhurst, from his study overlooking the peaceful Hudson, Gould watched this fire with icy calm. For him, this was not a social problem. It was another hostile takeover attempt. The workers were not people, but a faulty asset that needed to be either repaired or written off. The contrast was monstrous. Here at Lyndhurst, gardeners trimmed the lawns and servants polished the silver. There, in Texas and Arkansas, the thugs he hired from the Pinkerton agency opened fire on the strikers. Here, the quiet rustle of leaves. There, the roar of gunfire and the screams of the wounded. At least 10 workers were killed. Dozens were injured. Blood was spilled on the very rails that brought him millions. Every tie in his railroad network had been paid for with sweat, and now, with the blood of his own employees, he was offered negotiations. He was begged to compromise, but Gould refused. He saw it as a sign of weakness. It was then, in the midst of this war, that he uttered the phrase that would become his epitaph, a phrase full of boundless cynicism and cold calculation. "I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half." He broke the strike. He won. But this victory left a deep scar on his reputation. Now he was hated not just on Wall Street. He was hated in every working-class town from St. Louis to Dallas. During those days, Lyndhurst was not just a home. It was a war room. From this impregnable fortress, he waged war against thousands of his own countrymen. The castle was not protecting him from foreign enemies. It was protecting him from the very people on whose backs his empire was built. Jay Gould's deadliest weapon did not shoot, did not explode, and had no sharp edge. It was almost silent. And it was located here, in this quiet, almost sleepy room, among thousands of leather-bound books. The Lyndhurst Library was not a scholar's retreat. It was the brain of an empire. In a corner, among the folios and globes, stood a telegraph machine. Its wire, like an artery, ran through the wall and stretched for miles, connecting this quiet castle directly to the frantic heart of Wall Street. The quiet click of the telegraph in the Lyndhurst Library was the most powerful sound in America. It was the sound by which fortunes were made and destroyed. Gould understood what his enemies did not. Money is merely a consequence. True power is information, and he decided to seize it all. He launched a devastating attack on the Western Union Company, the telegraph giant. He didn't buy it outright. Instead, he created a cheap competitor, laying his lines along his own railroads, crashed their stock, and then, when the giant was wounded and bleeding, he bought it up for a bargain. This was not just another deal. This was the seizure of the nation's nervous system. Now, every important piece of news, every stock market report, every political secret passed through his hands. He could feel the nation's pulse before the nation itself could draw a breath. He became the digital god of the 19th century, all-knowing and invisible, and he used this weapon without the slightest hesitation. Owning the New York World newspaper, he could sit in his chair at Lyndhurst, receive insider information via telegraph, dictate the right headline, and the next morning, watch as the panic or euphoria he had sown changed stock prices in his favor. The threads of this web all converged here, at Lyndhurst. The castle was not a sanctuary. It was a nerve center. From this deceptive tranquility, Gould controlled the chaos he himself created, pulling the invisible wires that entangled the entire country. He had subdued the world of men and machines. But there was one more force he longed to control, a force far more ancient and unpredictable: nature. Beyond the walls of Lyndhurst, in the world that despised him, Jay Gould was a destroyer. But here, on his own land, he became a creator. He had one passion, one obsession that, at first glance, contradicted his entire nature. He loved plants. But this was not the love of a gardener. It was the love of a collector, the love of a conqueror. His battle for control of the world did not end on Wall Street. It continued here, in the gigantic glass structure he built on the site of a modest conservatory. This steel palace, 400 feet long, was his personal Eden. But an Eden built according to the laws of the stock market. Inside this cathedral of glass and metal was one of Gould's most prized trophies, his collection of orchids. 10,000 of the rarest specimens, gathered from all over the world. Each flower was not just a plant, it was an asset, rare, expensive, requiring constant control. His agents scoured the jungles of South America and Asia for new exotic species, just as his brokers scoured the stock exchange for undervalued companies. This conservatory was not a place for peaceful solitude. It was a laboratory for managing life. A complex system of heating and ventilation allowed him to create a perfect, artificial climate. There were no droughts, pests, or unexpected frosts here. Here, nature was stripped of its wild, chaotic essence. It was ordered, catalogued, and subjugated to his will. This was his ultimate metaphor. Outside, he sowed chaos to extract profit from it. Inside, he created a perfect, completely controlled world. A world without risk, without competition, without accidents. He didn't just grow flowers. He collected life, trying to prove that even its most fragile and beautiful manifestations could be subjected to the iron logic of capital. Every orchid in this collection was paid for by a strike or a market crash. This was beauty, born from cruelty. A trophy captured in his endless war against the unpredictability of the world. A war he fought on all fronts, including the one where the weapons were not stocks or flowers, but works of art. He had power. He had money in abundance, but he had no respect. To fight on this front, the one that mattered most to him, Jay Gould added a new wing to his castle, a vast art gallery. This was his heaviest artillery in the social war he waged against the New York aristocracy. And, as in all his battles, he bet not on taste, but on the overwhelming force of capital. He was not a connoisseur, He didn't spend hours in the Louvre contemplating masterpieces. He was a buyer. For him, art was just another asset, another line in a ledger. He bought paintings the way he bought stocks, in bulk, at market price, focusing not on artistic value, but on big names. His agents in Europe bought up canvases by French salon painters, Bouguereau, Gérôme, in entire collections. About 200 paintings arrived at Lyndhurst, like railroad cars full of coal. This gallery is not a temple of art. It is a warehouse of trophies. Every gilded frame screamed its price. Every canvas was not a window into another world, but a financial statement, confirming the owner's status. It was a desperate, almost clumsy attempt to buy what money cannot buy: acceptance, legitimacy, good taste. But the critics were merciless. They saw his collection as nothing more than a display of wealth, devoid of soul and true understanding. The luxury here was not light and festive, as in the Vanderbilt mansions. It was heavy, oppressive, almost vulgar, like the character of the master himself. The walls of the gallery were hung with expensive canvases, but the gallery itself was almost always empty. It was built not for guests, but for ghosts, for the very aristocrats who would never cross its threshold. It was a one-man show, where Gould, alone, contemplated the material proof of his success, trying to convince himself that he had won. He waged war against the world, against nature, against high society. But the most grueling battle took place not on Wall Street or in the art gallery. It was fought within him, within these same walls. It was a battle with his own shadow. Behind the massive oak doors of Lyndhurst, far from the telegraph and the stock market tickers, lived another Jay Gould. And this man was the complete opposite of the monster depicted in the newspapers. The castle walls hid the main paradox of his life. At work, he was a ruthless predator. At home, he was a loving father and a faithful husband. The man who would ruin thousands of families without blinking an eye cared tenderly for his own. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He had no mistresses. All the energy not spent on destroying other people's empires, he invested in building his own small, isolated world. But even this world was saturated with his paranoia. He had a mortal fear of being poisoned. His food was prepared separately, under strict supervision. Every bite was a potential threat. The fortress he built had to protect him not just from bombs, but from poison in his soup. He filled this house with everything money could buy, trying to create the illusion of a normal, happy life. He built the country's first private two-lane bowling alley here. But the laughter of players in this hall was rarely heard. Lyndhurst saw almost no guests. It was not a house for entertaining, but a refuge, a golden cage. And in this cage, his children grew up. They had everything: silk dresses, ponies, toys from around the world. But they lacked one thing: the world itself. They didn't play with other children. Their only playground was this vast but completely sealed estate. They grew up in the shadow of their father's reputation, in a luxurious isolation built on the hatred of an entire nation. What was the price of this happiness? A happiness bought with the misery of others? Lyndhurst was his attempt to create a perfect family, shielded from a hostile world. But the castle walls could not hide the main internal conflict. He built a paradise for his loved ones. But the foundation for this paradise was the hell he had created for everyone else. He fought desperately for the future of his family, for his dynasty. But he failed to notice that his greatest enemy had already breached the walls, and neither money nor power could defeat this enemy. Jay Gould defeated everyone. He defeated Vanderbilt. He defeated the government. He defeated the striking workers. But in his own blood lived an enemy with whom one could not negotiate, an enemy that could not be bought. Chronic tuberculosis, which had plagued him since his youth, began its final, decisive attack. And Gould, a man of only 5'3", felt time slipping through his fingers. This final battle, the battle with death, turned his life into a frantic race. He knew he was dying, and this knowledge gave his actions a quality of tragic madness. Every day was a battle. He had to finish furnishing the castle, turning it into the perfect nest for his dynasty. Finish strengthening the empire, making it invulnerable to enemies after he was gone. Finish securing his children's future, protecting them from a world that would seek revenge on them for their father's sins. This haste was palpable in everything. Every new stained glass window ordered from Tiffany was not just a decoration. It was a desperate attempt to leave a mark, to immortalize his name in glass and light. Every painting bought, every antique vase was a projectile fired at oblivion. He surrounded himself with eternal, incorruptible things, as if trying to catch their immortality. Lyndhurst ceased to be just a fortress against living enemies. It became his mausoleum, which he was building in his own lifetime. A monument that was meant to scream of his greatness when his own voice was silenced forever. He tried to pour his will into stone, into wood, into the earth, hoping they would hold it for eternity. He built his fortress. He filled it with treasures. He fortified it against the entire world. But he failed to realize that the most devastating blow would come not from the outside. It would come from within, from the very heart of his dream. The war was lost, not on the stock exchange, not in a courtroom, but here, in the silence of a second-floor bedroom at Lyndhurst. In 1889, his chief ally, his only confidant, his beloved wife Helen, died, and she was killed by the same enemy that was consuming him, tuberculosis. At that moment, the indestructible fortress developed its first, invisible crack. All the walls, all the towers, all the guards proved useless. The enemy had slipped inside, bypassing all defenses, and struck at the very heart. Gould, the man who controlled markets and moved armies of mercenaries, was utterly powerless against the disease that was taking his wife. His grief was immense, silent, like the man himself. He was crushed. The fortress he had built to protect his family from the world had failed to protect them from the fragility of the human body. The castle's facade remained as impregnable and proud as ever. But inside, in his soul, and in the soul of his dynasty, the first irreparable crack had appeared. Helen's death didn't just shatter a family. It shattered the myth upon which this entire castle was built. The myth that money and power could create a safe, perfect world. The myth of a happy ancestral home, shielded from all storms. The storm had come from within. Now he was alone, with 6 children, in a vast, echoing castle that suddenly felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb. He had won all his wars, but lost the most important one. The dream of a dynasty that would live happily within these walls for centuries began to turn to dust, and all he could do was watch, knowing his own time was also running out. What was life like in this golden cage, this Gothic paradise bought with the hatred of a nation? It was full of paradoxes. In public, Jay Gould was a monster, a financial vampire. Here, in the muted light filtering through Tiffany windows, he was just a father, a single father, desperately trying to keep his small world from falling apart after his wife's death. This castle, designed as a theater of power, was never the stage for grand receptions. Its corridors never knew the noise of balls. Its dining room rarely saw more than 8 people at the table. It was a quiet, almost monastic world. The only known guest whose name went down in history was former President Ulysses S. Grant. The man whom Gould had once masterfully deceived during the Black Friday affair, and years later, in a fit of inexplicable generosity, had saved from complete bankruptcy. This visit was not a social event. It was a collision of two eras, two Americas, two shadows meeting within the walls of a castle built on the ruins of their shared past. For Gould's 6 children, Lyndhurst was their entire universe. Their laughter echoed in the vast halls. They played hide-and-seek among the Herter brothers' furniture, and they rode ponies on the immaculate lawns. For them, it was a happy home, but it was happiness in a vacuum. Happiness isolated from reality by a high fence and thick walls. Happiness bought with the misery of thousands of other families whose fathers had lost their jobs on Gould's railroads, whose savings had been incinerated in the stock market fires he had set. Every dinner in this lavish dining room, every hour spent in the playroom, was paid for by someone else's hardship. Lyndhurst was an island of prosperity in an ocean of consequences, and the children, the heirs of this strange, isolated empire, absorbed this with their mother's milk. They did not know the value of money. They only knew its limitless possibilities. They did not know the world's hatred. They only knew the boundless love of their tyrant father. This fragile, artificial world was held together by the will of one man, and that will was fading. The 2nd of December, 1892. Jay Gould, at the age of just 56, dies. The enemy living in his blood has finally won. And at that moment, the country he held in fear explodes. It is not an explosion of grief. It is an explosion of euphoria. The news of his death, carried over the telegraph wires of his own Western Union Company, becomes a signal for celebration. On Wall Street, the stock indexes that he so masterfully crashed and inflated shoot upwards. Investors rejoice. The market celebrates its liberation from its chief manipulator. The death of one man brings a collective sigh of relief from an entire nation. The spider was dead. His vast empire, his fortune of $72 million, his control over 15% of all the railroad tracks in America, all of it passes into the hands of his eldest son, George Gould. But the fortune is not passed down with its key asset, the ruthless genius of its creator. George inherits the throne, but not the skill to rule. The very moment the dynasty's founder dies, his great dream begins to crumble. He wanted to build an eternal empire, ruled by his descendants from within the indestructible walls of Lyndhurst. But he could not pass down his grip, his paranoia, his hunger. He left his children the money, but he didn't teach them the cruelty that was necessary to keep it. The fate of the castle, like the fate of the entire empire, was now in the hands of the heirs, people who grew up in a golden cage, who never knew the price of the money their father had made. Outside the walls of Lyndhurst, the world was preparing to take its revenge, and inside, the children, unready for this war, began to divide the inheritance. The turning point had come. The countdown to the end of the dynasty had begun. The dynasty that Jay Gould had forged from steel and fear crumbled like sand. The money made in chaos was spent with reckless elegance. The heirs, who had never known their father's battles, lost the war with the world he left them. His son, George Gould, tried to wear his father's armor, but it was too big for him. He engaged in costly wars with other tycoons, built his own railroads, trying to surpass his father's shadow. He failed. By 1923, the Gould Railroad empire lay in ruins, driven into bankruptcy. His daughter, Anna, waged a different war, a war not for power, but for status she desperately tried to launder his money with aristocratic titles. She married a French count, spending over $10 million on his debts and chateaus, and after a scandalous divorce, a duke, finally buying herself the highest title. The millions squeezed from American workers turned to dust at European balls. The vast fortune of $72 million, 163rd of the United States gross national product, evaporated. By the end of the 20th century, almost nothing of it remained. The dream of a dynasty had turned into a farce. And here, on the ruins of this dream, the unthinkable happens. Anna Gould, the Duchess de Talleyrand, the last owner of the castle, lives out her days. And in 1961, she makes a decision that changes everything. In her will, she bequeaths Lyndhurst to the nation. The irony of fate proved more ruthless than any stock market crash. Dozens of other Gilded Age mansions, built for celebration and vanity, were wiped off the face of the earth, demolished for suburban housing. But Lyndhurst, this dark fortress built on fear and contempt, survives. It is saved by the last representative of the dynasty that nearly destroyed it. Jay Gould wanted eternal power for his family. Instead, he got eternal life for his house. He wanted his name to live on in his descendants, but it was frozen in stone. Today, Lyndhurst is not just a museum. It is a mausoleum of the American dream, taken to its most ruthless and tragic extreme. A fortune created by destruction paradoxically served the cause of preservation. And looking at its towers, we are left with the ultimate question: can beauty born from cruelty ever redeem its origins? Or will it forever remain just a gilded monument to destruction? In the end, the story of Jay Gould and his castle is not a tale about wealth. It is a parable of how the most ruthless destructive force can, against its own nature, create something unshakable and beautiful. The fortress built on fear outlived the empire built on greed, leaving us not the legacy of a dynasty, but an eternal paradox in stone. And when we admire its beauty today, should we forget the price that was paid for it? Can a stone that has absorbed so much pain ever be just a stone? This debate is eternal, and it has no single right answer. We would be very interested to read your opinion in the comments. If this story made you think, please support us with a like and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the most complex paradoxes of history together.